David Foster Wallace was an abusive addict, a womanizer, and before he got sober, a crappy human being. And in today's video, I'm going to be detailing the abuse and trail of destruction that David Foster Wallace left behind him. And I love Wallace's story because he hits a redemption arc in the last 10 years of his life after he got sober. Because let's just be honest here, you guys. You and I have skeletons in the closet. We have left a trail of destruction behind us at times in our life. And if you haven't, then you are probably just a very controlled and stressed out and scared NPC because when you tap in to that entropy of youthful energy and wildness, and even of love and drugs or any of these other things, things can spiral out of control. You may not be in control of yourself at all times. And of course, as you guys have heard on this channel before, I do not advocate for violence in any manner. I think people who are physically abusive and all the pieces of crap out there, throw them in the pit of despair. But as we're about to hear about Wallace's life, it's not like he was punching people. It's not like he ever physically abused anyone. And I'm not shrewd or some weird man with my PBR who doesn't want to admit that emotional abuse is real and a lot of the times much more problematic because of how widespread it is into our society and into relationships. So we'll be mostly detailing today a lot of Wallace's emotional abuse and two of the semi-physical acts that he did toward one of his girlfriends, former girlfriends. And the main person we're going to be talking about today is a Mary Carin. We see her here when around the age that she started dating Wallace, which was the late 80s and early 90s. And she is a writer and has released multiple books, and they kind of started getting with each other on that account. And both had issues, both had problems, and both were engaged in a romantic and sexual relationship with each other that was on and off for years. And so a little bit of respect for Carr, even though she's kind of come out and kept hurling all these accusations we're going to talk about at Wallace kind of time and time again, 30 something odd years later. She did say in a comment that someone was like, I'm never reading Infinite Jest again. We shouldn't read David Foster Wallace. And she said, no, almost everyone on your bookshelf has problems and you should just read it. Like, there's no time for us to be assessing certain authors about what they did or didn't do. We should just enjoy their work. So massive respect to her on that end, because most people in the world today in kind of that circle would say, never read him again. You have to read all these people. And that's what I feel like where a lot of this energy is coming from in terms of canceling authors is that it's like a replacement. They want to take this person in so that they can put their people in, because then you're like, okay, who can we read? We can't read really anybody anymore because it transcends the personal life. If your work is misogynistic or isn't kind toward women, or if you don't have enough women characters, or if women aren't smart enough or valiant enough in your novels, then you're a misogynist and you're out too. And when you talk to these people, and as someone who spent 8 years in academia, they want to kill it all. They want to get rid of everybody. And that's what this channel is a vanguard against. I am not going to let literature die. There is no possible way that we can let these people win, because right now we are letting them win. They have single-handedly taken over the publishing industry. If you do not believe me, go look up the Twitters of all the people that work at Random House or Penguin, you guys. Look at all the top executives and your mind is going to be blown. You're going to understand that any new author with anything controversial or anything that's rocking the boat, they're going to have a very hard time getting published over there. And this has infiltrated all the media and presses too. And so when we talk about Wallace's abuse and some of the terrible things and weird stuff that he was doing, we have to start at the start with his parents, both of whom were professors, a professor of English / linguistics and a professor of philosophy. And from day one, there were massive academic expectations put on Wallace. He, of course, I think had genetic gifts, a high IQ, a lot of a disposition for knowledge, for writing, because his sister never really suffered from a lot of these issues. So Wallace, who was the older brother, had all this attention put on him. And there are accounts of them driving in cars and their parents, instead of listening to the Eagles or something, whatever you listened to in the 70s or 80s, they would be playing tapes of the Oxford English Dictionary and talking and singing songs about tenses, and they would always be correcting and quizzing each other over grammar and all these things. And that is way too much. That is, you think, helping your child become smarter, but what it really is doing is creating polarity and pressure in their brain to always be able to perform and develop a very odd and competitive relationship with, grammar and language, because there's this hierarchy. Mom and dad are really smart, and now I'm trying to be better. And this is somewhat rare in our society because most of the time, parents are like who are, put that pressure on their kid are doing it for business or to act a certain way. Your dad owns this nice company and you're going to take it over one day, or you need to be able to impress his friends. So you're going to have to act a certain way. And if you go to private schools, which I used to work at one, all these kids, act good, they look good, but they're all like on these crazy drugs behind the scenes and are really weird because of all this pressure. But none of them were pressured with the language bug. Wallace was pressured with his language bug. And what that does, though, is that it gives you the ability to become this massive self critic from day one. Because once you harness the power of language, the first person you always turn it upon is yourself. And all of us have done that or doing that currently right now. And imagine doing that to yourself with the ability that you have, because Wallace at 13 or 14 is more intelligent than a lot of us, maybe even me, but a lot of people who are listening right now. And so that at that level of emotional immaturity, he started to have panic attacks. He started to self destruct. And very early in his life, at 12, 13, 14, started to smoke weed and drink, which, that isn't the end of the world for a lot of teens. A lot of teens have done that all throughout time. I have kids who I teach today that are 14 or 15 years old, and I know they party. I hear them talking about partying all the time. Sometimes they show up to school and it smells like a ganja farm. But one would also say I've known a lot of these kids over the last 6 years and in my personal life. Obviously when I was in school, and just, you meet people, and the kids that were doing that, they have a way less of a chance of turning out successful in terms of academic merit and citizen merit. And so Wallace, though, is a little bit different of a case. He's doing this as a way to self-medicate, to kind of move him away from this kind of psychic pain that he has, which I think was also a bit of a genetic disposition to sensitivity and stuff. So he's this sensitive, smart character who's been drilled with language, and at a very early age, he starts to numb himself. And this is where the addiction starts. This is where the distortion of reality begins. One could say, as we learn in Infinite Jest, what addiction really is just fantasies and distortions of reality. You become so into the substances and this false reality that you let everything else go. That's why addicts, destroy their family and their jobs, and lose all their money, is because it's just they think it's them and the drug. There's nothing better than that. And eventually they realize when it's just them and the drug and they're on the streets that the drug is slowly starting to eat them, the disease. And language actually distorts reality. Language is actually a magical system that creates altered states. When I read something, there are phantom voices speaking to me. There are visions manifesting in my head. And so at an early age, if you are reading a lot of the time, you're being transported into these different realms, when you should probably, as a kid, be spending time out in nature and really enjoying this aspect of reality. And that's why a guy like a Cormac McCarthy, who had a ton of outdoor hobbies and spent almost all of his time outdoors and almost through his whole adolescence and young childhood. That's why, even though he had a lot of personal problems that are different, he lived a much more stable and calm life and really had no mental breakdowns of note. And I think the same could be said with most of the people I know who were raised in more of a chill, more rural area with big yards and a big focus on nature and camping and stuff. They usually turn out a lot more stable than the people raised in urban cities or just even in suburbia. And so, continuing on, Wallace has this distortion of reality before he touches drugs, but drugs now give you an instant opportunity. And so he becomes addicted. And this, it doesn't get out of control because he's obviously in high school playing competitive tennis. And a lot of the stuff we hear about Halling, Cadenza and stuff, and a lot of stuff going on there was an account of what he was going through. Use of drugs and this kind of contemplation of tennis at a deeper level. And it seems innocent at this kind of young age. Boys will be boys. This is kind of what people do. But as we start to move forward, Wallace gets into a prestigious college, Amherst College. And when he goes there, these expectation and this competition of academics reaches ahead, because at his high school, no one was competing with Wallace. No one was as smart as Wallace. He was the top dog, or, one of the very few. But at Amherst, there were a ton of people. He had friends and roommates and professors that had this very high bar, these very high expectations for him. And Wallace didn't want to just meet these expectations, but transcend them completely. And so that took up a lot of time and there was a lot of pressure. And Wallace, I think, during his freshman year actually dropped out for a semester because of how deep the pressure was on him. He just came home and did nothing. And I think that happened for sure two, if not three times during his undergraduate career. He had to take a semester off because of these massive panic attacks that he was having. And this is where he first started his SSRIs that would eventually lead to his suicide when he tried to get off of them. And by the time that he was in college, he was an alcoholic. He was drinking a lot, and he discovered marijuana for being able to write fiction a lot better, because Wallace, who's kind of this logical, philosophical type, has all this energy, and I would say a lot of creative energy, but weed helped helped him let it out. It helped him kind of be able to engage in these fictional conversations and these dialogues and have fun with it and be able to laugh about it. And he put it in a lot of practice. A way to get good is just say, hey, I'm going to write 50 short stories and I'm not going to publish one of them. There's no pressure here. I'm just going to play with these characters, play with voices. And that's what Wallace was doing for years. So by the time he got to The Broom of the System, he had experience. And even though it's not a great novel and it has a lot of struggles, within it in terms of voice and style and a lot of that stuff, he pulls it off because he did put the practice in, and then he just combined a lot of his intellectual gifts to turn it into kind of this Wittgensteinian metaphor. Anyway, needless to say, by the end of his undergraduate career, things were slowly starting to decline in terms of his substance abuse. But what else was also was happening was that he got published. I mean, he got I think, a very high five-figure deal, like definitely over like probably $40,000 in terms of his advance for Broom of the System as a 22-year-old. How many people have an advance at 22 years old for a complicated metafictional novel? Not that many. And so he eventually moves on to the University of Arizona in Tucson, where I'm at right now. And Wallace does not feel supported. He does not really get the opportunity to develop some of these constraints, some of these anchors that would help him later in life. Because first of all, he's cocky. I mean, he's got an ego. You guys have heard David Foster Wallace talk. I wouldn't say an ego, but he's very confident in his intellectualism. And a lot of the time, it's a front for getting women. Because let's get honest, orgasms are drugs. And a lot of addicts also have problems with, sexuality in general, and whether being like totally asexual or being kind of on and off manic about sex. And the other thing about all that is the domination of women. And so that's where we're kind of getting into now with Wallace, is that around this age, he had some girlfriends at Amherst. I think he started to tap into this idea that he was this kind of powerful person, that there was this world of NPCs out there. And I don't endorse this, obviously, but I've felt this kind of in my heart before and kind of tried to work through it. And luckily was not famous already, so I could just have instant access to all these people. I was working through this when I was living in the middle of the desert, caretaking a property, and had no social media and no cell service, and there was no women of note anywhere within an hour of me, a car ride away. So, thank God for that. But Wallace took this hierarchical approach toward women, saying, look, I know all this stuff. I'm not just hot shit, but I may be a little bit nihilistic, because drugs and alcohol, once again, when you start turning on yourself, you become more nihilistic, more whacked out of your mind. And with Wallace's interest in math and Wittgenstein, it becomes very easy to kind of just fall out of touch with reality. And so one of the ways you can gain autonomy back is through the domination of other people, especially sexually. And so that's what Wallace started to engage in, womanization. And when you are functioning at the level that Wallace is with his confidence and all these other things, you can basically, if you're dealing with someone who's never read, who is somewhat trusting and kind-hearted, you can just walk all over them. You can make them believe and do whatever you want. And that's what Wallace was doing. He was just blowing through these women and seemingly offering a relationship or some bigger picture and sleeping with them for a little bit and then just moving on. And obviously, if you've ever been in a relationship before, those first couple weeks feel like a drug. You feel like you're on a high. There's all these new connections and possibilities and dreams, all these new things you're learning about each other in terms of the mind, body, and soul. And so if you just keep that going forever, that actually turns into a drug. This is where we kind of get into sex addicts, and I wouldn't necessarily classify Wallace as that. I've never really heard about that, but judging from that cycle that he was starting with women at the University of Arizona, that's what was going on, because he had a somewhat steady girlfriend, but he was also banging his professor. He was banging undergraduates. It was like a lot of weird and wacky stuff going on with him there. And so I think that's this building this idea, this kind of false self, as Freud would say. And around this time, he starts to publish his book, A Girl with the Curious Hair. And as I talked about in the minimalism video, he got no support around campus with all of his peers and professors for that story. So he starts to become a little bit edged in terms of shielding himself off from people. He was just saying, you know what, I need to just get through this time. And so he would hole up during the Arizona summers in one of these houses and watch a bunch of TV, get loaded, and write. And this kind of started this cycle of drugs that would later cycle into him eventually ending up in a halfway house that resembles the Ennett house in Infinite Jest. And so this is in Wallace's time in Boston after Harvard, and this is also around the time where he meets Mary Carr. And so I've kind of given you guys the background of how Wallace got to be an addict. And when you are an addict, it's very easy to become abusive. When you have this self-inflated ego and you've been with all these different women, then what happens when you link on a woman? Because one word that we could describe Wallace Wallace as, I think throughout his entire career, was obsessed. When he got into something and wanted to dial in, he got really into it. And Mary Carr to him felt, this girl right up here, she felt like a muse to him. And that's a very dangerous thing. I've seen men do this to women before. When they feel that a woman is an inspiration or like lifts them up, it can be a very dangerous thing because they are the drug now. They are that thing. And what happens if they leave? And so a massive codependent relationship started to happen between Carr and Wallace. And eventually things started to get wild because Wallace hadn't really been engaged in a lot of these long term relationships. And when he did, they never were actually living in the city with him and being involved like that. So Carr and Wallace started to get crazy. And Carr is no angel herself. From all the available accounts I saw, that she was also very screwed up and toxic and would engage in Wallace in these things. And anyone that gets with an addict most of the time has a very screwed up past and childhood. Because when I meet someone new, you guys, like a friend, if I'm considering someone to even be my workout partner or someone I talk to or hang out with, in the first 20 minutes, figure out if I'm going to be their friend or not. Based on certain questions I ask, are you religious? What are your views on politics? All these different things. And depending on how they answer, then, or are you into drugs? Like, are you an addict? I try to get a feel. Like, are you kind of a daily drinker who's like getting loaded all the time? I get all this information in my head because I'm looking for a certain type of person. I only have time for certain people. And if you're not that, then let's just get it out of the way at the start, and then I can move on. And so there's no mystery there if you ask everything up front. Like I knew this girl or this woman, a couple years back, and she was a friend of my wife and I's, and she was in this abusive relationship with this guy that ended up physically abusing her and being weird. And at some point during this process of talking to her, I kind of worked out, and she didn't really know, and she had to go reaffirm that this guy was actually a big Christian, which doesn't mean you're going to be an abuser at all. But she had no idea, though, because that connected a bunch of other dots. He drove a big truck. He liked to drink PBR. His dad was a piece of crap to his mom. And he was one of those call himself a Christian when it's convenient and use it as a scapegoat, but never actually go to church type Christians. And so those type of people, when combined with getting drunk all the time and coming from abusive households and being, that don't really appreciate women and see them as the lesser, that kind of combined it all because there was a reinforcement. There was actually a system of scapegoating because in her mind, she was like, okay, his dad's bad and stuff, but he can beat that. But now she realized that he believed in something, and the way that he was applying Christianity was supporting the abuse. And that actually, the realization of that helped her kind of move toward getting out of that relationship eventually. But a lot of people don't talk. It's actually crazy, you guys. A lot of people, they don't actually talk to their partners or know anything about them or go very deep. And so then all this hidden stuff comes up later. And you don't want to make this mistake. And one of the questions I always ask is, hey, if you and I, or if someone talked crap to you or like your family out in public, if someone said something very insulting to you, what would you do? And back in this day, I had a friend and I became friends with him because he was very proficient in athletics, especially kettlebell training. He was certified with all these kettlebell certifications that I eventually got, but I was looking to him to model to lift myself up. But I asked him this question really early and he said, yeah, I beat the shit out of him. But I was like, wait, we're going to the gym together. We don't hang out outside of the gym at all. Maybe after the gym, we may go get a bite to eat or something. No big deal, right? But lo and behold, at the gym, two guys are taking way too long on the squat rack, like these two Eastern European guys, and they're like everywhere, and they got sunglasses on, and they're taking forever. And he kept asking them, like, hey, are you guys done? Like, what's the plan here? How many sets are you doing? They were doing like 10 sets of deadlifts each, and it had been like 20 minutes, and we tried to get everything else done, and like these guys were just not getting off of it. And eventually, him and this guy get into it, and they start throwing hands. And then the friend looks at me and walks over to me and starts trying to fight me and like shoves me. And I'm like, oh my God. And I started leaving because I'm like, I'm not getting involved here. I'm not loyal to this cause. I'm not dying on this hill. I'm not risking anything here because having done jiu-jitsu for years, I'm going for the takedown, and a takedown onto cement with equipment everywhere could lead to something bigger. I'm already thinking of this and knowing this. I'm like, okay, I'm not risking this. So eventually he gets thrown out of the gym and they break it up. And I'm sitting there like, this could have been bad for me. And I could have totally avoided this by asking questions. And so I don't know if Carr either was the type of person who didn't ask questions and realized that David Foster Wallace was an addict, if she was a person who just liked his fame and didn't care, or if she was just so innocent, or she was just an addict herself. She either didn't know or was too innocent. She was in it for the fame, or she was just also a really toxic and terrible person. And honestly, from what I've surmounted, I would say that options 2 and 3 are correct. And so now let's hear a quote from Carr about what happened between Wallace and her. And I should have probably presented this a little bit earlier, but of course, on Right Conscious, we go deep. I'm giving you guys all the information and connecting it all together. Quote, 3 years later, DT Max published his biography of Wallace, in which he divulged more shocking details about the relationship with Carr, that Wallace tried to buy a gun to kill her husband, that he tried to push her from a moving car, while also dropping enough details about Wallace's sex life and professed attitudes toward women to make him sound like one of those his own hideous men. Wallace called his female fans at his readings audience pussy, wondered to Jonathan Franzen whether his only purpose on earth was to put my penis in as many vaginas as possible, picked up vulnerable women in his recovery groups, admitted to a fetish for conquering young mothers, like Orin in Infinite Jest, and affected not to care that some of the women were his students. Okay, so let's take this kind of step by step here. All right, so the details about Carr and Wallace are as follows. He supposedly tried to push her from a moving car. Probably in a fight, probably out of fit of rage. She didn't want to get out. Who knows what the hell happened there? You know, that's bad. That's a story worth telling later on about why this person was bad, but I wouldn't classify that as like some crazy form of abuse. You know, if she fell out of the car, then maybe, I guess there was intent there to do that or not. But I've been in relationships before with women and we're stuck in the car together and we're fighting and things aren't going good. And they're like hitting me and like, get out of the car. I have a buddy who lives up in Portland now and he got thrown out of a moving car one time because she was hitting him and hitting him. So he just got out and he was on some Texas highway alone at night, like a really small one, and had to hitchhike, walked for like an hour. No one was picking him up. And eventually some weird rancher picked him up and was like, yeah, been there before, son. And so and before we get to the plot to kill the husband, the other big one is that he smashed a coffee table, like he picked up a coffee table and smashed it in front of her. Abusive emotionally, but unfortunately, that's kind of a commonality in America. I've known lots of friends, I've known lots of people who punch walls when they get mad at home and they break things. And I don't do that. I don't like people that do that. I don't associate with people who do that. That's kind of one of the things I try to figure out also. I think that if you're not in that much control, then you're absolutely insane. I understand with money and marriage and kids, a lot can be on the line and stuff, but come on, everybody. Okay, so he's a little bit crazy. Okay. And then there's a plot that he tried to kill her husband he bought a gun to kill her husband. And he was also stalking her. He would also be out her house outside of her house all the time and like showing up and like he moved next to her and like he was weird for years, even when she got married. Okay, so we got a stalker, David stalking. That's weird. I mean, I can't excuse that behavior. I don't like people like that. I don't think it's kind. It's really creepy. But kind of the angle that's being taken here in a lot of these articles is we shouldn't read him, that these actions are irreparable. That he thought, this little nerdy guy, I got a gun. I'm going to do it. I'm going to kill someone. That's all just, in my opinion, a lot of that's just dramatization. But when someone's stalking you, it feels scary. I mean, let's just be honest here. Wallace is on drugs and he was bottoming out. So I shouldn't discount this experience that much because Wallace was bottoming out at this time. And when you're at that level, then you do destructive things. So she obviously felt scared. She should have felt scared. There was a dude she didn't want around, like being majorly abusive or like creepy and causing a lot of intense energy and stress toward her. And she should never forgive him for that. And we should maybe never forgive him for that. But once again, that doesn't need to affect how we interpret his stories. It honestly just makes his biography a lot better. I mean, it just makes it more fun to talk about that this guy drove himself so mad with language and writing and this acquisition of knowledge and this experience and fame that he drove himself to all of this. You can't be happy in this state. This may sound fun to be able to be conquering young mothers, but it's actually not. When you're in it and you're in that mentality, you are at a desperate point just looking for love. So enough on all that. The Mary Carr allegations are the biggest ones, and there are a couple other people have come out and said, he was my professor, he slept with me, he pulled me into this push-pull relationship where he would act like we were going to be together forever, and I would sleep with him, and then he wouldn't call me, and then we'd hang out again, and he said we'd be together forever, and I'd sleep with him again, and that kind of went on forever. And I would ask, first of all, whose fault is that? A player's a player. Everybody knows when you're with a fuck boy or a fuck girl, but what you're doing is thinking you could be the one. I could change him. He's going to like me the best. I'm going to be the one that's going to get him to marry me. I'm going to get him to calm down. It's the old fixer-upper, right? Why a lot of women get, and same with men, why a lot of people get with certain people is they want to fix them up. There's this girl and she's from the streets and she's had all these problems and I'm going to calm her down. I'm going to show her the good life. I'm an engineer at Apple and I have all this money and everything's going to be fine. People are so ignorant. I mean, it's sad. I mean, it's really sad to think that people take this mentality because we love that. We love the idea of redemption and the underdog and getting something inaccessible. It's like going to this, driving past the Ferrari dealership and you see this guy and it's like, I could get that, if I just take out this really big line of credit and get really lucky with this business and take out some other loans, like maybe I'll be able to do it. And maybe you do. Sometimes people find a fixer upper and they actually fix them up, but sometimes they don't. So now let's kind of talk about this hierarchical relationship because all throughout time, at this moment right now, and this will probably never end, people, when they're given the opportunity to exploit power, money, and sex, most of the time are going to take it. I mean, it's just the way the world works, unfortunately. And obviously, what we're trying to do on this channel here, and with yoga and meditation, and with reading or the contemplation of your religion or whatever, you're trying to transcend a lot of those things and like be better and like good for us. But even the best of us, even a lot of us out there, can't maybe resist all three. And most of us have never had the opportunity to be able to buy into that. Most of us feel strong here in the moment right now. But how many women are sliding into your DMs right now that are just magnificent? They aren't just as hot can be, but they are smart and funny and will do anything that you want to do to them. There's no commitments involved. You can just sleep with them and no big deal. You don't have to be in a relationship and they'll fly out to you. Just give them a plane ticket and they'll be there right now. How many of you guys are dealing with that reality? Just that potential. Hundreds, if not thousands of women ready to do whatever you want. Women better than anyone you've ever been with before. All right. So we don't know how you would react. How about money? How many of you guys have these major opportunities for money or power and being able to get that and like sell out, but like maybe do a little destruction along the way and maybe hurt some people, but you make a lot of money? How many people are involved in that? Maybe a little bit more. But Wallace is in one of these positions. He's, first of all, famous. He's an author, and authors always have this huge mystique about them. He's an author of books that are hard to crack, which is a fixer-upper mentality. He's hard to crack then. I could figure out what's wrong with him. There's all this depth involved with Wallace when really he's just a vacuum of nothingness because he's an addict. He's just like is purging all this information, all this trauma. But when you get to know him, he really can't communicate or love you very well. So Wallace decided to exploit this, as he talked about, picking up women in his recovery groups, which is kind of a no-no in AA. Addicts shouldn't be getting with addicts. And if there's a girl in an Alcoholics or Narcotics Anonymous meeting, then they are, what we're at bottom or are recovering from the bottom. And they are a lot easier to get with. They have a very low self-esteem. Same with young mothers. Some of the people with the lowest self-esteem in the world are single mothers. And if Wallace kind of had this fetish, from what it's sounding like, to dominate these people, then there's nothing better than that, because young mothers, all they're looking for is someone to help them. They're seeing Wallace as someone who can change their life to be a father figure and make sure that they don't have to work anymore because they're dealing with all these problems. They have to work and take care of their kid, and there's all these distressful realities. And so Wallace is the king fixer-upper because he offers an instant way out for them. But what we're dealing with right now is consensual relationships. We're dealing with people who are making bad decisions. There are players in this world. There are sharks in the water everywhere. And if you're not strong enough to deal with them and you're consenting and you're taking this risk to maybe fix them up, then I am very sorry, but it's on you now. And you can complain later, but you were the one at the reading that decided to give Wallace your number and go out with him later that night. And that's just two adults, in my opinion. And so when we get to kind of the students thing, once again, we're not dealing with something illegal. Obviously, all high schools in America, it is illegal to be able to be with your student. And usually that gap is very broad. These people these children are living with their parents still and are very young and are trying to make their way into love and life and all these other things for the first time. They're at step 1 or step 3. But as you move into college and into graduate school and stuff, people, first of all, are consenting adults and could do whatever they want. And obviously, it's not a great look for Wallace, because when I look at people, women who are 18, 19 years old, I don't really feel very much. I'm not very excited. It's just kind of like, what are we going to talk about? This isn't going to be very fun. But that's because I'm not trying to dominate anyone. I don't have this fetish to be like, oh my God, I need to be able to dominate these people and to be able to feel more powerful, to build up my own self-esteem. That doesn't need to happen. And so just on a very practical basis, obviously people who are 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 are very beautiful, most male and females. It's the peak of beauty for a lot of different people. And that's wonderful. But I have transcended looks entirely. There's something much deeper at the soul and personality level and practicality level if you're dating someone who you're going to commune energetically with than just how they look. And so it feels like Wallace is just moving through these students as a way to recover from his addiction, because he gets sober and you have to replace it with something. He's smoking cigarettes, and also the reality change and that feeling of getting with women was there for him for a long time. But what's interesting is when he started, he went with this for, what is it, 10 years maybe? From 1990 to 2000, he was engaging in this kind of womanization of all his fans and whatnot. And unfortunately, that is not uncommon. I would say even the most social justice writers out there, especially that are male, have used their writing to leverage women. If we look at a lot of these guys, if you're a 5 without your writing and you could be an 8 with your writing, are you really just going to date 4s, 3, 4s, or 5s who are women, or are you going to try to leverage some 8s? I would say that everyone who's ever had any fame or any stuff like that, it's a very rare exception of someone who hasn't done that. And so now, in retrospect, I think that Wallace is obviously a bad human being, but he did change. He did get with his is it wife, his girlfriend? I forget right now, but he was stable the last years of his life. He wasn't getting audience pussy. He wasn't doing these things. He was being a lot more kind to people, including his students, people in his personal life. He learned to set boundaries, and that's when the drugs really started to get out of his system. When he really started to establish, after a couple of years of being sober, this new life and not needing to devolve into these other fantasies and into these ideas. And so the other big claim that is always made, right, is that, hey, you can't read this because David Foster Wallace is also misogynistic. Okay, so everything you just said, Ian, that's okay. We get it. We made some mistakes. Everyone does. No one would actually agree with that who's making these accusations. But all right. But he's also misogynistic in his stories. He has all these characters that are doing the exact same things that he was doing. Isn't that training this generation of today to do the exact same things? And I just have to say, I am not a child. All my readers not my readers, all my audience members out there, all you guys listening right now, if you're still here, shout out to you. You guys are not going to read a book and be like, oh my God, like I can be like Oren and like go conquer young mothers. I can go do all this. I have permission now. Thank you, David Foster Wallace. I can be like him. This is what I'm going to do. Obviously, there are nutcases out there and the exceptions of the people who get too obsessed with an author, who start running their playbook. But most people, I take this in and I enjoy looking into the mind of someone who does do this. Just like how I enjoy looking inside of the mind of people like Alicia Western in Cormac McCarthy's novel Stella Maris, who is this female schizophrenic physics genius. And same with a lot of other female characters. That's the whole point of literature. Every single character is different and has their own quirks. And the more quirks, the better. And the more entertaining they are. But I don't become some weird schizophrenic because I read about a girl who is schizophrenic. I mean, it's not slowly. Obviously, we are being primed and programmed by everything. But I would ask you guys. So now we're at the head here. Okay, so there's misogyny in the world. Men aren't treating women correctly, supposedly. And that is true. There are domestic abuse is the most underreported crime in America. And men really do treat women bad still to this very day, all the time. There are people right now who are doing that and you don't even know it's happening. But you're telling me it's art's fault. You're telling me that right now, Andrew Tate is popular, or like a lot of these weird guys are popular because of misogynistic writers or even music. What do you guys think the real problem is? Don't you remember what the real problem is? What do you guys think is actually going on here? Well, oh yeah, the same people who levy these accusations every single time, who care about these things, especially in terms of like art. Why are they never conservative? Why are they never libertarian or an anarchist? Why are they always on the left? And let's just talk about the elephant in the room right now, everybody, is that every single year, more and more children are having to rely on the state. They're getting put through a system, a reinforced consensual reality, determined by public education and their parents. And what is happening to their kids? They are less happy, less healthy, and less intelligent than ever. There is a downhill slide going on. And I know, as someone who has read a lot, been a teacher for 6 years, that kids who are left by their parents to be raised by the state, by the media, just by the world, do not turn out okay most of the time. That I know kids out there who have a single mother and they have a couple siblings, but their mom works really hard and she is very kind to them and she keeps them on track and she raises them. That's the whole point. Raise is a verb. She raises them up in consciousness and helps them and teaches them. And they get help at school and stuff, but they stay on track and they use school as a vehicle to elevate themselves and move forward and to read and to grow. And they're great kids. And I know other people whose parents are professionals like doctors and they're never home and they just let society, let the school system, let other people and friends and media raise their kids. And a lot of the time I've noticed that those kids do not turn out as well because it requires someone, like I said, a kid has to be raised. And so if a parent doesn't raise or family members don't raise, then who else is going to raise a child? And unfortunately, a lot of the time, the public school system is so constricted in terms of what it can do and what it can teach, and the time that we have and our ability to connect one on one with students, that teachers and in general, the system can't necessarily elevate and raise kids entirely to the point that they need to be. And it can happen, but it usually requires a very willing student. I've had students like that who they're very willing and open to teachers and open to new experiences and are very kind, and they can be elevated by the system, and that's happened countless times all throughout history. But if you are met with someone who is resistant to change, and then has parents who aren't help or a community who aren't helping them, and then they're reinforced by a media that's utterly negative, that is anything and everything all at once. I can send you down any rabbit hole. You could be a furry or a goth or whatever else you want to be, and you just get sent down that into simulacra archetypes forever. Then you're having no ability to let your elders or let real education from anyone, even your peers, really affect you and be able to help you grow. And so I would say that it's not art that is creating this funnel for people and students and young people to kind of become radicalized in a negative manner that maybe one day would become violent, and this kind of continuing cycle of sexism, racism, or some of these things happening. It's definitely not media's fault. It's definitely not the author's fault or artist's fault. It is, in my opinion, the government's fault, and obviously parents' fault, because the only way to guarantee that every child gets raised is to make sure that every parent raises their child, because kids can drop out of school, kids can slip through the system, kids can get bad teachers or just once again not be receptive at all, just be totally standoffish, and they're not going to be helped. So the only way that we can guarantee that and those numbers are getting bigger every single year. Those numbers that kind of slip through the system, it's usually getting worse. And the lack of good food that and good education and good media and positivity that's being put out and encouragement to be better does not help that either. And so to put the blame on authors and to be canceling people and saying it's reinforcing this and reinforcing violence when the real violence is coming from the system that a lot of these people love and are building up, then it's crazy. It's a massive piece of blindness. But once again comes down to personal accountability. That once you give up personal accountability and put it into the hands of somebody else to raise your child, to do something else, then it's a risk. You never know what's going to happen. And the same is for your own autonomy. If you put your own self-defense in the hands of the police, well, what if the police don't show up in time? What if the police are corrupt or like can't help you or something happens or they don't have the funds to help you? Like if you're living in a major urban city, even though they would want to help you, they just literally can't. Then what happens? Then you're either prepared or you're not prepared to defend yourself. What happens if your child just, gets, is that's in a class with some weird kids and they start to bully him and he gains a reputation forever? Are you going to make a change or are you just going to let that continue? Are you going to take that autonomy? You gave up that accountability to do some work at home and over the summer to help your kid or to homeschool, best in my opinion. But we can't count on other people and the government to be accountable for us. We can help. The whole point, if you believe in all of this and in the government, is that it catches the loose ends, that we have a social fabric, and if some people fall off or there's some outliers, then they kind of hopefully can be brought back in and taken care of. And that's the whole point of a community, that eventually you can reach that point. But I know that reading David Foster Wallace is making me a better human. I know that everyone who has read him has been intellectually challenged, has seen where intellectualism and where the mind can go, not just with writing, but with knowledge and philosophy and thought. And that later on leads to more development. That leads to you being a better person most of the time. There's some people who take knowledge and they go totally negative with it. They go totally lit bro. But a lot of other people do not, and they grow from it. And that's what I'm trying to push on this channel. And if you are still with me, thank you guys for being here. And I will see you guys a little bit later today for another David Foster Wallace video.